Everyone laughed at it. When the first reports came in about the new American carrier fighter, Japanese pilots didn't panic. They didn't scramble their engineers, they didn't lose sleep, they laughed because they had the Zero. And the Zero in their minds was untouchable. It had carved its name into the sky over China, over Pearl Harbor, over the Dutch East Indies, over every theater where the rising sun had pushed forward. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was not just a fighter, it was a symbol. It was proof that Japan belonged in the air. And when word spread that the Americans had built something called the Grumman F6F Hellcat to counter it, the reaction was dismissal. Another American plane, another slow, clumsy machine built by a country that still hadn't figured out how to fly. They were wrong. Not a little wrong, not technically wrong in some footnote buried in a history book. They were catastrophically, completely, irrevocably wrong, and by the time they realized it, the skis that had once belonged to the Zero were gone. The pilots who had laughed were gone. The carrier groups, the air wings, the elite corps of aviators Japan had spent years training, gone. Wiped from the sky in a campaign so decisive, so brutal, so one-sided that historians would eventually call one of its defining battles the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Not a battle, a turkey shoot. That's what it looked like from the American side. That's what the Hellcat had turned it into. If you want to understand how that happened, you have to understand what the Zero actually was. You have to understand why it was so feared, why it seemed so invincible, and why the very things that made it deadly also made it fragile. And then you have to understand what Grumman did, what they built in a timeframe that nobody thought was possible. How they took everything the Navy had learned the hard way, every mistake, every downed pilot, every combat report written in blood, and turned it into a machine that didn't just match the Zero. It murdered it. This is the story of the F6F Hellcat. And if you think you already know it, you don't. Not really, not the full weight of it. Not what it meant when the tide finally turned and those Japanese pilots who had laughed realized too late that the sky was no longer theirs. Before the Hellcat, there was the Wildcat. And before we get to what the Wildcat was, we need to understand what the Zero was, because the Zero is where this whole story begins. The Mitsubishi A6M0 entered service with the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1940. It was, by every measurable standard, one of the finest fighter aircraft in the world at that time. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi, it was a masterpiece of compromise, which is another way of saying it was a masterpiece of sacrifice. Horikoshi understood that in aviation, everything is a trade-off. Speed costs weight, armor costs speed, range costs both. So to build a carrier fighter that could fly farther, climb faster, and turn harder than anything else in the Pacific, he stripped everything unnecessary out of it. Self-sealing fuel tanks, gone; heavy armor plating behind the pilot, gone; structural reinforcement that might survive a few extra bullets, gone. What was left was an airplane of almost breathtaking performance. Light, fast, incredibly maneuverable, with a range that shocked American analysts when they first realized how far these things could fly. Zeros appeared over targets that nobody thought a carrier-based fighter could reach. The calculations didn't add up until they did, and the answer was terrifying. When the Zero appeared over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, American pilots were flying a mix of older aircraft, P-40s, P-36s, and the Grumman F4F Wildcat, which was the Navy's primary carrier fighter. The Wildcat was not a bad airplane. It was sturdy, well-built, honest in the way Grumman always built their planes. But against the Zero in a traditional dogfight, it was at a disadvantage. The Zero could outclimb it, outturn it, and in the right conditions, outrun it. American pilots who tried to turn fight with Zeros died. The ones who survived learned fast that the only way to stay alive was to use different tactics. Dive, attack, extend. Use the Wildcat's superior diving speed and its structural toughness. Never, under any circumstances, try to match a Zero in a turning fight, because you would lose, every time. But tactics only carry you so far. You can't win a war purely on discipline and clever maneuvering when the enemy has a qualitative advantage in the air. What the Navy needed was a new airplane, not an upgraded Wildcat, not a modified anything. A genuinely new aircraft that could take everything the Zero threw at it and hit back harder, and they needed it fast. The war wasn't going to wait. Enter Grumman. Specifically, enter a company that had built its reputation on ruggedness, dependability, and the kind of engineering culture that said if you're going to build it right the first time. Grumman's nickname in naval aviation circles was the Iron Works, not because their planes were slow or ugly, but because they were built like they were supposed to survive. Wildcats had come back to carriers with damage that would have destroyed more delicate aircraft. Grumman pilots joked that you could park a Wildcat in a tree and she'd still taxi home. That culture, that philosophy, was about to produce something remarkable. The story of how the Hellcat came to be is often told as a simple upgrade story. Grumman took the Wildcat, made it bigger, gave it a more powerful engine, and called it a day. That version of the story is wrong in almost every important way. The Hellcat was not an upgrade, it was a response. A direct, calculated, intelligence-driven response to exactly what American pilots were telling Navy engineers about the Zero. After the early months of the war, the Navy was gathering data. After-action reports from pilots who had survived engagements with Zeros were being analyzed. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, who would become famous for developing the Thatch Weave, a defensive tactic designed specifically to counter Zero advantages, was feeding information back up the chain. What did the Zero do well? What did it do poorly? Where were the gaps? And crucially, if you were going to build an airplane to kill it, what would that airplane look like? The answers were clear. The Zero was fast but fragile. It could turn inside almost anything, but it caught fire easily. Its pilots were skilled, some of the best in the world, but they had weaknesses in high-speed maneuvers. The Zero's controls stiffened dramatically at high speed, making it hard to roll at high velocity. An American pilot who could get above a Zero and dive on it was playing on better terms. But to do that consistently, you needed an airplane that could reach altitude fast, hold speed in a dive without falling apart, and absorb punishment long enough to get home. The Hellcat was designed to do all of that, and then some. Grumman began serious design work on what would become the F6F in 1941, before Pearl Harbor. The initial specs called for an aircraft that could use the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, an 18-cylinder two-row radial that produced nearly 2,000 horsepower. To put that in perspective, the original Wildcat used an engine producing roughly 1,200 horsepower. The Hellcat was going to have dramatically more power available, and the airframe was being designed from scratch to exploit it. After Pearl Harbor, the timeline went from urgent to critical, and here is where the Hellcat story becomes almost unbelievable. Grumman, working around the clock in a program of engineering intensity that has few equals in American aviation history, went from prototype to production in a timeframe that defied conventional wisdom. The F6F prototype flew in June of 1942. By October of 1942, the F6F3, the first production variant, was flying. By January of 1943, it was being delivered to naval squadrons. By late 1943, it was fighting over the Pacific. From serious design to combat deployment in roughly 2 years, and not just any combat deployment. A combat deployment against arguably the most dangerous fighter in the Pacific theater, that is what Grumman accomplished. But speed of development would mean nothing if the airplane wasn't right, and the Hellcat was very, very right. The F6F3 that rolled off the production line and into the hands of Navy pilots was a big airplane. That's the first thing you noticed. The Wildcat was a compact, almost stocky machine. The Hellcat was larger, heavier, with a wide, solid presence on the deck. Some pilots, when they first saw it, worried that it was going to be too heavy, too slow. Those worries disappeared the moment they fired up the R2800 and felt what 2,000 horsepower actually meant in terms of climb rate and acceleration. The Hellcat's maximum speed was around 376 miles per hour at altitude. That made it faster than the Zero in most combat conditions. Not dramatically faster in straight-line terms, but fast enough. More importantly, the Hellcat's rate of roll at high speed was superior to the Zero's, and its dive speed was exceptional. Where Zero's controls would go stiff and unresponsive as it accelerated into a dive, the Hellcat remained controllable. That meant American pilots could use vertical tactics, diving attacks followed by climbing extensions, that the Zero simply couldn't follow effectively. The armament was devastating. 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing. These weren't the small caliber weapons that sometimes struggled to knock down well-built enemy aircraft. The .50 caliber was a serious weapon, and 6 of them firing simultaneously produced a cone of fire that was lethal to almost anything it caught. The Zero, stripped of armor to save weight, was particularly vulnerable. Hellcat pilots quickly learned that even short bursts from those 6 guns was often enough to light up a Zero's unprotected fuel tank. And speaking of protection, the Hellcat had everything the Zero lacked. Self-sealing fuel tanks so a few bullet holes wouldn't necessarily turn the aircraft into a fireball. Armor plating behind the pilot, real armor, substantial armor, not a token gesture. The cockpit was armored in ways that gave pilots genuine protection against the defensive fire they might face. The Zero pilot sat in a beautiful, responsive, lethal airplane with almost nothing between him and any round that found him. The Hellcat pilot sat in something that felt almost like a fortress by comparison. The landing gear was another quietly important detail. Grumman designed the Hellcat's gear to retract outward and fold up into a wide, stable stance that made carrier landings vastly more forgiving than the narrow-track gear on many competitors. Carrier aviation is extraordinarily demanding. The margin for error when you're bringing a plane down onto a moving flight deck at sea is measured in feet. A stable, predictable airplane that pilots could trust in those final critical seconds of approach was not a luxury, it was survival. All of these features, the power, the firepower, the protection, the stability, came together in an airplane that Navy pilots almost immediately began to love. It didn't feel like a compromise. It felt like something built specifically for the job it was being asked to do, because it was. Now you need to understand what happened on the Japanese side of this equation, because the story of the Hellcat cannot be separated from the story of Japan's decline in the air. And that story is as much about human beings as it is about machines. Japan entered the war with one of the finest naval air arms in the world. The pilots who struck Pearl Harbor were professionals, many of them with years of combat experience from the war in China. Men like Saburo Sakai, who would become the highest-scoring surviving Japanese ace of the war. Men who had grown up in the Imperial Navy's rigorous, demanding, often brutal aviation training pipeline. It was not easy to become a Japanese naval aviator in the 1930s. The washout rate was extraordinary. What remained was a cadre of exceptional airmen. But here is the problem that Japan built into its system from the beginning and could never escape. Quality was prioritized over quantity. The training pipeline was long, demanding, and slow. Japan could produce exceptional pilots, but it could not produce them fast enough, and it had no plan for what to do when those exceptional pilots started dying. In the first months of the war, they didn't die in large numbers. The Zero was dominant enough that Japanese losses were relatively light compared to the damage they were doing. But attrition has its own mathematics. Even a small percentage of losses, sustained over months of intense combat, adds up. By midway in June of 1942, Japan had already lost some of its experienced aircrews in ways that were difficult to replace. Midway itself was catastrophic not just for the 4 fleet carriers lost but for the air groups that went down with them. Those weren't just airplanes. Those were irreplaceable, highly experienced pilots and aircrew. After Midway, Japan was in a different war than the one it had entered. Not immediately, not visibly, but structurally. The balance had shifted, and every subsequent campaign, Guadalcanal, the Solomons, New Guinea, would grind away at Japan's aviation strength in ways that the Imperial Navy's training system simply could not keep up with. Guadalcanal was particularly brutal. Japanese aircraft from Rabaul flew long missions to contest the skis over Henderson Field, missions that pushed the range of their aircraft to the limit and gave pilots almost no margin for error in getting home. Losses mounted. Experienced men were replaced by less experienced men. Less experienced men died faster, which required replacing them with even less experienced men. The spiral was in motion. Meanwhile, the Americans were building the most efficient military aviation training system in the history of warfare. The numbers are staggering. During the war, the United States trained roughly 300,000 pilots, not 300,000 military personnel, 300,000 pilots. The pipeline was massive, systematic, and designed to produce large numbers of competent, combat-ready aviators quickly. They weren't all exceptional. They didn't need to be. They needed to be good enough, flying good enough airplanes in large enough numbers to overwhelm an opponent whose excellence was running out. When the Hellcat arrived in the Pacific in late 1943, it arrived into this context. American pilots who were well-trained, flying in coordinated tactical formations, using radio communication effectively, executing doctrines developed from hard experience, now had an airplane that matched and in many respects exceeded what the Zero could do. The tactical advantages that Japanese pilots had exploited were disappearing one by one. The first major test of the Hellcat in significant numbers came during operations in the Solomons and during the raids on Rabaul in late 1943. These engagements gave Navy pilots their first real look at what the new airplane could do against Zero opponents. The results were encouraging. Hellcats were handling Zeros in ways that the Wildcat never could. Pilots could accept combat on their terms rather than fighting defensively. The advantages of the new aircraft, speed, firepower, protection, were showing up exactly where the design team at Grumman had intended them to. But the real reckoning was coming. It would arrive in June of 1944 in the waters west of the Mariana Islands, and it would be called the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And before we get there, we need to understand what Japan threw at it, because what Japan brought to that battle was supposed to be enough to stop the American advance cold. Japan called it Operation Ago. It was their plan to lure the American fleet into a decisive engagement, destroy its carrier air arm, and restore the strategic balance in the Pacific. The Japanese mobile fleet assembled for this operation was formidable on paper. 9 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and supporting those aircraft were land-based planes from airfields throughout the Marianas, Guam, Tinian, Saipan. The plan was to use those land-based aircraft to wear down the Americans before the carrier battle even began, and then catch the U.S. fleet in a crossfire between carrier aircraft and ground-based planes. The Japanese were also banking on something they called the outer air battle. Because the Zero had longer range than the Hellcat, Japanese strike groups could launch from much farther out, beyond the range at which American aircraft could pursue them or strike back. Hit hard, fall back, hit again. The range advantage would be the decisive edge. There was, however, a problem, several problems, and they were all fatal. The first was intelligence. The Americans knew the Japanese plan, not in every detail but enough. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the U.S. Fifth Fleet, understood what was coming and positioned his forces accordingly. The fast carrier task forces of Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher were ready, and they had radar. Not the primitive early warning systems that struggled in 1942, but improved radar that could pick up incoming formations well before they arrived. That meant fighters could be vectored out to intercept, could climb to altitude before the enemy arrived, could have every possible advantage in an interception scenario. The second problem was the land-based aircraft. The Americans had been systematically destroying Japanese air power in the Marianas for weeks before the battle. Preemptive strikes had wrecked the air groups on Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. The forces that were supposed to be fresh, waiting to pile on, had already been shredded. Japan's multi-layer strategy depended on those squadrons being available. They were barely functional. The third problem, and the most fundamental, was the pilots. Japan launched the AGO operation with air groups that were largely trained in haste by experience standards. Some of these pilots had remarkably few flight hours. Some had never experienced real combat. They were being sent against the most effective naval air defense in the world, flying into radar-guided intercepts executed by some of the most experienced carrier pilots America had produced, in aircraft that simply outclassed their own. The fourth problem was the Hellcat. June 19, 1944, Japan launches its first strike. 69 aircraft headed for the American carriers. The Hellcats go up to meet them. What follows is not really a battle in the traditional sense, it is a slaughter. The American radar picks up the incoming formations long before they arrive. Hellcat pilots have altitude on the attackers, they have speed. They have the advantage of position, of surprise in the sense that they can dictate the terms of the engagement. Japanese pilots, many of them inexperienced, find themselves suddenly attacked from above by large, fast, heavily armed fighters that are not behaving the way the Zero might have led them to expect. There is no tentative sparring. The Hellcats come in hard, firing, braking, climbing again, coming back around. Of those 69 aircraft in the first wave, 42 are destroyed, 42 out of 69. The survivors limp home or are lost trying to find carriers that have moved. The second wave is launched. It's even larger. It's even more disastrously intercepted. The third and fourth waves are met with the same results. Throughout the day, Japanese aircraft are falling from the sky in numbers that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. American anti-aircraft fire accounts for some of those losses, but the Hellcats account for most of them. By the end of the day, Japan has lost over 300 aircraft. 300! American losses in the air are in the dozens. The disparity is so staggering that American pilots can barely believe their own kill counts. One pilot, Commander David McCampbell, leading his air group into the intercepts, will eventually become the Navy's top ace of the war, with many of his kills coming in exactly these kinds of engagements. It is in the aftermath of this day that someone coins the phrase turkey shoot, because that is what it looked like, not a battle between equals, not a hard-fought contest between warriors meeting with honor, a turkey shoot. Aircraft falling in such numbers so easily that experienced American pilots were almost unsettled by how one-sided it was. What the Japanese had built their entire strategic vision around, air superiority in the Pacific, was gone, not weakened, not degraded, gone. But the story of the Hellcat doesn't begin and end with the Philippine Sea, as decisive as that battle was. The Hellcat was fighting and winning from the moment it entered combat, and it would keep fighting until the last day of the war. To understand why it was so dominant, you have to look at specific engagements, specific moments where the difference between the Hellcat and the Zero played out in the most concrete terms imaginable. Take Rabaul, November 1943. Rabaul was Japan's major base in the Southwest Pacific, a fortress of aviation assets that had been grinding down Allied forces for more than a year. Admiral Halsey needed it neutralized. He ordered carrier strikes, even though his carrier forces were smaller than ideal for attacking such a heavily defended target. Essex-class carriers with Hellcat-equipped air groups launched the strikes. The Japanese response was significant. Interceptors rose to meet the American strike groups. What happened was revealing. Hellcat pilots flying in coordinated sections and divisions, executing the kind of disciplined tactical flying that Navy training had developed, ran through the defending Zeros in ways that shocked Japanese commanders. Aircraft that should have been evenly matched or that Japanese doctrine suggested would be at a disadvantage were dominating the intercepts. Some Japanese pilots with real experience recognized the difference immediately. This was not the Wildcat. This was something else entirely. Something faster, something harder to kill, something that hit back with a ferocity that the old American fighters hadn't possessed. The Rabaul strikes effectively broke Japanese air power at that base. Not in one day, but over a series of raids, the fighter strength that had made Rabaul so dangerous was destroyed. And the Hellcat did the lion's share of that work. Or look at the fighter sweeps over the Marianas in early June 1944, the pre-invasion air campaign that was supposed to clear the skies before the amphibious landings. These missions were exactly what they sounded like. Large formations of Hellcats sent in specifically to find and destroy Japanese fighters, to provoke them into combat and kill them. It was a doctrine enabled by confidence in the airplane. You don't send your fighters out to look for fights unless you believe in those fighters. And Mitcher's aviators believed in the Hellcat in a way that military effectiveness requires and that equipment only earns through demonstrated results. Those sweeps were enormously successful. Japanese air power in the Marianas was battered and broken before the landings even began. And when Operation Ago was launched and the Japanese Mobile fleet committed its air groups to the battle, they were already fighting an American fleet whose fighter arm was at full strength, fully supplied, and flying with total confidence. Now consider the pilot quality dimension more carefully, because it matters enormously and it's often understated in popular accounts that focus on hardware. The Japanese pilots who faced the Hellcat at Philippine Sea were not the men who had struck Pearl Harbor. Many of those men were dead. Others were scattered across the Pacific in other assignments. The pilots flying off the Japanese carriers in June 1944 were often young, often with limited combat experience, often pushed through training programs that had been accelerated under the pressure of war and attrition. The Imperial Navy knew this was a problem. Some commanders had argued against committing to Operation Ago precisely because the air groups weren't ready. They were overruled. Those young Japanese pilots met American pilots who were on average very well trained. The Navy's flight training system had been producing combat-capable aviators in large numbers for 2 years. Many of the Hellcat pilots at Philippine Sea had combat experience from earlier in the war. They understood the Zero's tactics, its strengths, its weaknesses. They'd been briefed, trained, and prepared specifically for this kind of engagement. They flew in coordinated formations using radio to pass targeting information, to warn each other, to direct attacks. Against an enemy that was often disorganized by the disruption of the intercept and by the inexperience of the pilots, American teamwork was overwhelming. The radar-guided intercept system, the fighter direction officers who sat below decks on the carriers managing the disposition of Hellcat squadrons, directing them by radio to where the enemy was coming from, at what altitude and what numbers, was a force multiplier of extraordinary effect. Japanese aircraft that thought they were approaching undetected were in fact being tracked from the moment they appeared on radar, often while still 100 miles out. The Hellcats climbing to meet them had time to gain altitude, time to position themselves for a head-on or overhead attack, time to coordinate. The Japanese had no equivalent system. Their pilots flew toward the American fleet hoping to make it through. Most of them didn't. But let's be precise about the Hellcat's mechanical excellence, because this is something that deserves more attention than it sometimes gets in popular accounts. The airplane was not just good on paper. It was reliable, maintainable, and resilient in the field in ways that mattered enormously in the brutal operating environment of carrier aviation in the Pacific. The R2800 double WASP engine was one of the greatest aircraft engines ever built. It was powerful, yes, but more than that, it was durable. It could take damage that would stop other engines and keep running. Hellcat pilots came back with holes in their engine cowlings, oil streaming down the fuselage, and the R2800 still turning. Pratt & Whitney had built a masterpiece, and Grumman had built an airframe worthy of it. The maintenance requirements of the Hellcat in fleet service were significant, as they are for any high-performance aircraft, but the airplane was designed with the maintainer in mind. Access panels were positioned logically. Systems were laid out so that mechanics working in demanding shipboard conditions in heat and noise and the constant motion of a carrier at sea could actually reach what they needed to reach, replace what needed replacing, fix what needed fixing, and get the airplane back in the air. This kind of design consideration rarely gets the attention it deserves in histories focused on dogfights and tactics. But the ability to generate and sustain sortie rates matters as much as anything else in a sustained air campaign. The Hellcat could be turned around efficiently, and that meant American carriers could maintain the kind of tempo that buried the opposition. There is also the structural durability story. The Hellcat was built to survive. American carriers in the Pacific were not always safe places to land. Rough seas, battle damage, mechanical failures, all of these could contribute to hard arrivals on the deck. Grumman built the Hellcat to absorb those arrivals. The landing gear was engineered to take punishment. The fuselage was designed with strength where strength was needed. Pilots who came back shot up who had to land with damaged hydraulics or locked controls or injuries that affected their technique found that the Hellcat often forgave what should have been a catastrophic landing. It wasn't indestructible. Nothing is, but it was forgiving in ways that saved lives. The Hellcat also had genuine advantages in the high-altitude environment where some of the Pacific Air War was fought. At altitude, the Zero's performance degraded noticeably. The engine wasn't optimized for sustained high-altitude combat the way later aircraft would be. The Hellcat, particularly in its later F6F variant, retained its performance at higher altitudes better than the Zero did. This meant that American pilots who established an altitude advantage could often maintain it, dictating the terms of the engagement rather than being forced to meet the Zero on equal footing. The F6F, which entered service in 1944 and became the primary production variant, incorporated refinements from combat experience and improved the already impressive performance of the F6F. Minor aerodynamic cleanups improved top speed slightly. The cowling was redesigned. Spring-loaded tabs improved aileron control at high speeds, making the Hellcat even more responsive when diving. The armament was retained, sometimes supplemented with 20 cannon in certain configurations for specialized roles. Provision for rockets and bombs made the Hellcat a capable ground attack platform in addition to its fighter role. That versatility was important in the Pacific Campaign, because the naval air war was not only about air-to-air combat. Carriers needed strike capability, the ability to hit ships, airfields, harbor facilities, supply dumps. The Hellcat could carry bombs, it could carry rockets, it could strafe. Pilots who trained primarily as fighter pilots found themselves flying strike missions that required completely different skills, and the Hellcat handled those missions competently. This multi-role capability, common in later generations of aircraft but harder to achieve in the piston era, reflected Grumman's understanding of what the Navy actually needed versus what a pure performance specification might demand. By the numbers, the F6F Hellcat's record in the Pacific is almost surreal in its dominance. American sources credit it with over 5,000 aerial victories against fewer than 300 losses in air-to-air combat. That is a kill ratio somewhere in the range of 19-1. 19 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat. In aviation history, there are few records that compare. The Hellcat accounted for approximately 75% of all aerial victories credited to the U.S. Navy in the Pacific War. 75% from one airplane type, in a war that featured multiple aircraft types on the American side. Those numbers demand explanation beyond simply saying the Hellcat was a good airplane. They demand the full picture. Yes, the Hellcat was exceptional. Yes, the R2800 was outstanding. Yes, Grumman designed it brilliantly. But those kill ratios also reflect the training disparity, the intelligence advantages, the radar-guided intercept doctrine, the sheer industrial capacity of the United States producing both aircraft and pilots in numbers Japan could never match. The Hellcat was the cutting edge of that system. It was the weapon at the point of the spear. But the spear had a shaft, and that shaft was the entire American war machine humming at full capacity. What Japan brought to oppose it was a fighter designed in a different era, for a different kind of war, by engineers who had made brilliantly logical choices given their constraints, but who had built something that the realities of 1944 would brutally expose. The Zero was not a bad airplane. It was an airplane of its time that had been surpassed. The men flying it were not cowards or incompetents. Many of them fought with extraordinary courage in the face of impossible odds. But courage has limits. And when you are flying an airplane with inferior firepower, inferior protection, inferior performance at the speeds that combat had evolved toward, against an enemy who is better trained, better equipped, and guided by radar you cannot see or respond to, courage is not enough. The Hellcat's dominance over the Zero is sometimes described as if the outcome was inevitable, as if it was simply a matter of the Americans being Americans and the Japanese being outclassed. That's a lazy reading of the history. There was nothing inevitable about it. Different choices at different points could have produced different outcomes if Japan had developed a more effective training pipeline. If the Zero had been replaced more quickly by its successors, the N-1K Shiden, the A-7M Reppu, aircraft that might have been more competitive with the Hellcat. If Japan had prioritized radar development, if Midway had gone differently, any number of historical branch points could have led somewhere else. But the choices that were made on both sides led here, to a sky over the Philippine Sea littered with falling Japanese aircraft, to a Turkey shoot that was no shoot at all but a systematic annihilation of a force that had once seemed invincible, to the effective end of Japanese naval aviation as a serious strategic threat. There's a human dimension to this that numbers can't fully capture. Think for a moment about the Japanese pilots who flew into that battle in June 1944. Many of them were young, some were barely adults. They had trained hard in a system that demanded everything from them and accepted them only after proving themselves worthy. They believed in what they were doing. They believed in the Zero because the Zero had never really let them down before. They believed in Japan's mission. They were not monsters. They were young men in an impossible situation, products of a system and a culture and a war that had placed them in the cockpit of an airplane that was about to prove inadequate to the task. And on the other side, the American pilots who climbed into their Hellcats that morning were also young men, also believers, also products of their system and their culture. They were better equipped, better supported, and operating in a context that gave them every advantage. But they were not invincible, and they knew it. Every pilot who ever flew into combat knew that regardless of your airplane or your training or your preparation, the mathematics of warfare could catch up with you on any given day. The Hellcat made those mathematics vastly more favorable for the Americans. It didn't make the war easy, it made it winnable, and then it made it won. After the Philippine Sea, the trajectory of the Pacific Air War was essentially set. Japan would produce brave pilots who would continue to fight, and eventually would produce the kamikaze doctrine, which was in some ways an admission that conventional air combat against the American fleet had become untenable. If your pilots cannot survive long enough to return from a strike mission, then you design a mission that doesn't require return. The logic is brutal and desperate. It reflects the depth of the hole that the destruction of Japanese naval aviation had dug. The Hellcat flew through the Philippine Sea Campaign, through the liberation of the Philippines, through the strikes on Japan itself conducted by carrier task forces that were now so powerful they could operate within range of the Japanese home islands with relative impunity. At Leyte Gulf, Hellcats provided air cover during the most complex and far-ranging naval battle in history. In the Okinawa campaign, they flew day after day against kamikaze attacks that came in waves and tested American pilots and anti-aircraft crews to their limits. The kamikaze was a fundamentally different problem from conventional air combat. Against a conventional fighter pilot who was trying to survive the engagement, the Hellcat's performance advantages were decisive. Against a pilot who had accepted death and was focused entirely on getting his aircraft into an American ship, the calculus was different. What mattered most against the kamikaze was getting to it before it got through. That meant interception at distance, early, aggressive, before the attacker could reach the fleet. Hellcat pilots became proficient at exactly this, developing tactics and working with fighter direction officers to establish outer layers of defense that could engage kamikaze formations as far from the fleet as possible. They were effective, not perfectly effective. Ships were still hit and men died, but effective enough that the fleet maintained operational capability through Okinawa and continued to advance. The kamikaze strategy, whatever else it was, did not stop the American fleet, and the Hellcat was a primary reason why. By the time Japan surrendered in September 1945, the F6F Hellcat had compiled the most dominant record in the history of carrier-based aviation. More than 12,000 were produced. Variants served with the British Fleet Air Arm as well as the U.S. Navy. Night fighter variants equipped with radar took the fight to Japanese aircraft that tried to use darkness as cover. Photo reconnaissance variants contributed to the intelligence effort. The basic airframe, the fundamental soundness of Grumman's design, was adaptable and reliable across a range of roles and conditions that no one could have fully anticipated when the first prototype flew in 1942. What ultimately makes the Hellcat story so significant is what it represents beyond the hardware. It represents a system that worked. Navy identified a problem, gathered data from the pilots experiencing that problem, communicated requirements to a manufacturer who had the culture and capability to respond, built and delivered an answer in a timeframe that should not have been achievable, trained pilots to exploit that answer effectively, and supported it with doctrine, logistics, and intelligence that maximized its impact. Every piece of that chain had to work. And in the case of the Hellcat program, every piece did work. That kind of systemic effectiveness is harder to achieve than building a good airplane. Good airplanes have been built by losing sides throughout history. The German Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were extraordinary aircraft. The Zero itself was extraordinary. Having the best airplane is not the same as having the best system. The Americans had built a system. The Hellcat was its finest product. Consider for a moment what might be called the Grumman factor more carefully. Because Lyric Grumman and his company deserve more credit than they typically receive in popular histories that focus on pilots and battles rather than on the engineers and factory workers who made those battles possible. Grumman had been building naval aircraft since the early 1930s. They understood carrier aviation in a way that came from long experience. They understood what a carrier-based airplane's life actually looked like. The salt air, the motion of the deck, the violence of catapult launches, the controlled crashes of carrier landings, the limited space for maintenance, the need for wings that folded to fit in the hangar deck. All of these factors shaped Grumman's engineering decisions in ways that a company without that specific experience might not have prioritized. The Hellcat's folding wing mechanism, which was beautifully designed and reliable in service, allowed the aircraft to be stored efficiently below deck, maximizing the number of aircraft a carrier could operate. This is not a trivial consideration. A carrier that can operate more aircraft can put more of them in the air at once. More aircraft in the air simultaneously is a tactical and strategic advantage. Grumman's engineering culture built that consideration in at the design level rather than treating it as an afterthought. The Hellcat also benefited from Grumman's willingness to listen to combat feedback and act on it rapidly. As reports came in from the Pacific about operational experience with the F6F3, Grumman incorporated lessons into the F6F5. This was not a slow bureaucratic process. It was quick, responsive, and grounded in the understanding that the men flying the airplane in combat had information that the engineers needed. That communication loop from cockpit to factory floor and back was a competitive advantage that showed up in a better airplane. And then there was production. Building 12,000 of anything in 3 years is a manufacturing achievement. Building 12,000 high-performance aircraft with the kind of quality control that keeps them flying in demanding combat conditions is a genuinely remarkable industrial accomplishment. American industry in World War II has been written about extensively, and rightfully so, because what it achieved was extraordinary. The Hellcat's production numbers represent a piece of that larger story. Grumman workers, many of them women replacing men who had gone to fight, working in shifts around the clock, producing aircraft at a rate that would have seemed fantastical in 1939. That human story, the factory workers in Bethpage, New York, who built the machines that flew over the Philippine Sea, is as much a part of the Hellcat's history as anything that happened in the air over the Pacific. Now, let's talk about the specific individuals whose names are inseparable from the Hellcat's story. Because while systems win wars, individual humans fly the planes and make the decisions in the critical moments. David McCampbell is the name most associated with Hellcat excellence. He was the Navy's leading ace of World War II with 34 confirmed aerial